Welcome to World History and the West. The topic for this week is Absolutism and the Enlightenment. The central question to keep in mind as we progress through the material is, was the Enlightenment solely the product of absolutism or the result of freedoms gained from the Reformation? Introduction. The powers of a monarch and the rights and freedoms of citizens has been a tension point for societies throughout history. European societal structure had always been defined by rigid social class, with the monarchs at the top. Many efforts, both violent and peaceful, had been made to limit the power of monarchs. The Magna Carta in 1215 was one of the first steps in limiting the power of the king. The process of further constraining monarchical power would take many centuries. The Enlightenment would be arguably the greatest challenge to the traditional powers of kings and queens, and one of the most influential events in Western history. Lecture context. Where? France and England. When? 1600s to the 1700s. Lecture topics: Absolutism versus the Enlightenment, Absolutism in France, most notably Louis XIV, England and the Glorious Revolution, the Enlightenment, thought, politics, and science. The central question to keep in mind: was the Enlightenment solely the product of absolutism or the result of freedoms gained from the Reformation? The broader picture. The age of absolutism preceded the Enlightenment. Both of these overlap with the Reformation and various religious wars, as well as the establishment of European empires. Absolutism and the Enlightenment. Absolutism is defined as the belief that monarchs are divinely chosen by God to rule over their subjects. An example is Louis XIV. He was chosen by God to rule France, had special gifts given to him by God to rule. Monarchs were divinely chosen by God, and God's will could not be questioned. Monarchs provided structure and order for society and enacted justice. Without a sovereign, a monarch, societies would descend into chaos. The Enlightenment was a revolution in science, politics, and thought. The scientific realm focused on empiricism, the need for evidence. The political realm questioned traditional authority. The thought or philosophical realm focused on human reasoning and freedom of thought. The relationship between absolutism and the Enlightenment. For centuries, monarchs had ruled over Europe. The abuses of power were many, and the plight of the poor often remained the same. Those at the lowest level of the class system had no privilege. The political sphere of the Enlightenment became a reaction to the excessive powers of monarchs. The Age of Enlightenment would be an important step in the development of democracy and liberalism. Democracy and liberalism would come to define the West. It would also be integral in dismantling slavery, discrimination, and promoting education. Without the Enlightenment, we would not have the quality of life we enjoy today. Some of the more prominent absolute monarchs. Charles II and the Habsburgs of the Holy Roman Empire. Probably the most famous absolute monarch, Louis XIV and the Bourbons of France. Elizabeth I and the Tudors. Frederick of Prussia. Peter the Great and the Russian Romanovs. Absolutism in France. Louis XIV served from 1643 to 1715. He epitomized absolute rule. His rule changed France in several ways, politically, economically, socially, and militarily. He gave himself the name the Sun King because he wanted his light to shine on the four corners of France. Absolutism in France. Political and economic influence of Louis. Louis inherited the throne at a young age. France was ruled by his mother, the regent, until he was of age. Once ruling, Louis sought to erode feudalism by centralizing power. He created the position of the intendant, which were civil servants who performed duties specifically for the king. Economically, Louis instituted the head tax. He appointed Jean-Baptiste Colbert as economic advisor. Louis and Colbert promoted freer trade within the country and encouraged other nations to buy their products. He also used state funds to create infrastructure projects like roads and canals. Louis made France into one nation as opposed to a series of districts ruled by nobles. By the end, the people of France were answerable to him and not the nobles. Absolutism in France. Social developments under Louis. With the dismantling of the feudal system, the lower class of French society gained greater freedoms. No longer did nobles control small districts and the people within. Instead, all were answerable to the king. Louis, however, did not want to dismantle the social class system entirely. He gave nobles important positions within government to maintain their support and even invited them to live at Versailles Palace. Developments in the military. In previous centuries, when France went to war, French nobles would each contribute soldiers. Louis created a national army that was highly trained and loyal to the king, not the nobles. He took part in several wars, most notably the Spanish War of Succession. He experienced limited success in these costly wars. Louis's France. The regions in orange denote the areas gained by Louis XIV during his reign. Louis and the Palace of Versailles. The most striking symbol of Louis's reign was the Palace at Versailles, located just outside of Paris. Built on the hunting grounds used by his grandfather, it was started in 1669 and completed in 1701. It was the grandest, most opulent palace in Europe. The impact of Louis XIV. Louis revolutionized France economically, politically, socially, and militarily. By his death in 1715, France was the most dominant European power. He was arguably the most prominent ruler in European history. However, within a century, France would abolish its monarchy and descend into the chaos of the French Revolution. 17th century England. Constitutionalism, not absolutism, ruled. Constitutionalism is when government powers are spread out among different levels of government. Essentially, the English monarchy had their powers limited by a parliament. However, there were still many challenges. James I supported absolute rule. Charles I fought with Parliament over money for his wars with Spain. Charles II learned the lessons of his predecessors and did not mess with Parliament. James II was an unpopular king because of his open Catholicism and returned to absolute rule. His reign would end with the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution of 1688. Absolutism did not take hold in England. The monarch's powers were restricted somewhat by Parliament. The Glorious Revolution is an example of the limiting of the monarch's power and a step in the direction of democracy. The road to democracy in England was very different from that of France. The conflict began when James II and Parliament disagreed. James was Catholic while most of the members of Parliament were Protestant. James then ended Parliament. As a result, the members of Parliament asked William of Orange and his wife, ironically the daughter of James, to invade from the Netherlands. When the force arrived, James fled to France. The Enlightenment and Science. In the 16th century, Copernicus began to question traditional ideas about the universe. He concluded that the universe was sun-centered instead of being geocentric, with the Earth at the center of the universe. The gulf between the church and science continued to widen in the 17th century. Two men in particular brought forward new ideas on the universe, Galileo and Isaac Newton. Galileo. In 1609, Galileo built a telescope to view the universe more closely. He concluded the world was heliocentric, sun-centered, and that the Earth moved around the sun. In 1603, Galileo was tried before the church for his theories. He was convicted of heresy and sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. This event highlighted the tension between science and the Catholic Church. Galileo was from the Italian states where Catholicism was still the dominant religion. Isaac Newton. Newton sought to merge the theories of Kepler and Galileo and developed the law of gravity. The force of gravity between two items is proportional to the distance between them. Newton was also a theologian that acknowledged God as the supreme creator. He believed science reaffirmed the beauty of God's creation. Deism. A common belief of many of Newton's contemporaries was deism. This basically means that God created the world and everything in it and then sat back and let things happen. Newton rejected this view of God and believed God was indeed active in the world. The Enlightenment and political thought. For centuries, it was believed that truths were arrived at by studying the Bible. The 17th century saw a rise in systemic skepticism, experimentalism, and reasoning based on observed facts and mathematical laws. This was known as the Enlightenment. The leading figures promoting these ideas include Francis Bacon, René Descartes, John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes. Francis Bacon. Bacon believed truth was determined by gathering evidence through observation and experience. This was known as empiricism. Empiricism would also greatly impact the development of effective medical practices. This was in sharp contrast to the superstitious nature of European society prior to the Enlightenment. René Descartes. Descartes believed humans must depend on their reasoning abilities. He developed 3 rules of logic for solving a problem. Number 1, seek clarity. Number 2, simplify. And number 3, move from simple to complex. His ideas would lay the groundwork for other French thinkers, which ultimately led to the French Revolution. John Locke was an English philosopher. He believed that over time people would join together to benefit from cooperation. Through a social contract, sovereignty would remain with the people. His ideas influenced the development of liberalism and democracy. Locke's ideas would be incorporated into the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who wrote the book The Leviathan. He believed that life began in a state of nature. Man is inherently selfish and aggressive, and left on his own, chaos and conflict would rule. Citizens need law and to follow a sovereign or monarch to avoid chaos. Hobbes's ideas would influence the development of conservatism. The conservatism of this era is different from the conservatism of our modern society. The second wave. A second wave of enlightened thinkers would follow and lay the foundation for the French Revolution. Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau would continue the evolution of political thought. Their ideas would strike a chord with French society and the abuse of power they experienced under Louis XVI. Some final conclusions. Europe's development and that of our world have both been greatly influenced by the Enlightenment. The development in areas of thought greatly altered the growth of science and democracy. Absolutism helped France emerge as the greatest power of Europe, but it also impacted the growth of democracy, as people desired greater individual freedoms. England's road to democracy was quite different, while France's road was much more tumultuous.